Hello, my name is Bob Veninga. I'm Professor Emeritus in the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota. And I'm very, very glad that you tuned into this telecast. I want this to be very practical. I want this to be very down to earth. Now, as you can tell from the title, the first part of the title is called Bouncing Back. And the second part of that title is that remarkable attribute called resilience. All of us need to kind of bounce back from life's hurts, pains, injustices. Sometimes they come in our personal life. Medical problems come up. Marriages that we thought were absolutely rock solid tend not to be as solid as we had hoped. Sometimes there's conflict at home with children. And so all kinds of things happen where we have to bounce back in our personal life. And in our professional lives, we have to bounce back too. There are times where we lose jobs that we value. There are times that we get new supervisors, and hopefully they're good supervisors. But as anybody who's been in the workforce for 10 or 15 years, once in a while, you get a supervisor that's very difficult to work with. And so all of us, in the context of our entire life, have to bounce back. Now, over the past 30 years, I and several of my colleagues here at the University of Minnesota have been focusing our research on resilience. And what we have tried to figure out is what makes people resilient. Why is it that you can have two workers and one worker comes home at the end of the day and says, boy, it was a terrific day. Everything seemed to go well. And you have another worker who's basically doing the same kind of thing, comes home at the end of the day and somebody says, how'd the day go? Oh, it's a terrible day. It was a very difficult day. Why is it that some kids seem to have a resilient spirit and other children, they kind of get knocked off the perch, so to speak, when things don't go well? And so for 30 years, we've been focusing our research on what makes people resilient. But during the past 5 years, I and several of my colleagues are focusing on an even more interesting question, and that is what keeps organizations resilient. Why is it that McDonald's, for example, right now, is building McDonald's restaurants all over the globe? And you can go into some communities in the Midwest and you find Hardee's that are boarding up. Why is it that BlackBerry was such a success? And today it is the iPad and the iPod that is the big success. What keeps the creative spirit of organizations alive? What makes them resilient? Now, I think the starting point, okay, and this is going to be kind of the foundation for everything that follows. I think the starting point is to tell you a story. And it comes out of Native American literature. And incidentally, if you've never gotten into Native American literature, you really want to do that because there is such wisdom that has come out of it. I want to tell you one of my very all-time favorite stories. There was a young lad in the tribe, probably around 13 or 14 years of age, who was really puzzled by the meaning of life. He couldn't figure it out. On the one hand, life seemed so beautiful. He knew he was loved in the tribe. He knew that he was cared for in the tribe. He loved to hunt. He could see the beautiful sunrises and sunsets. But the young lad also knew that life can be very harsh, particularly on the plains. People die. There was starvation. There were enemies that showed up on the doorstep. And so he was puzzled by this seeming contradiction in life. And so he went to his parents and said, I can't figure it out. On the one hand, things seem to be so good, and on the other hand, things seem to be so bad. I just can't figure this whole thing out. Well, if you happen to have children, you know there are times when your children have probably come to you and raised some of those big issues, and you kind of scratch your head and you say, man, I can't figure that out. And so what the Indian parents did said, we want you to go and see the elder of the village. And so the young lad went to the elder of the village, and he said to the elder of the village, I can't quite figure out life. On the one hand, it seems so beautiful, and on the other hand, it seems so awful. Can you explain it to me? And the elder of the village thought a minute, and he said, I think I can. He said, within every human being, there are two wolves. There is the good wolf, And the good wolf looks out at the world and sees a beautiful world. It's a wonderful world. And the good wolf is very glad to be there. But within every human being, there is the bad wolf. And the bad wolf looks out and sees a bad world. And the bad wolf becomes very cynical. And the bad wolf becomes very wary of other people, does not extend him or herself to other people. The bad wolf kind of pulls in within himself. So the young lad was sitting there contemplating this deep thought, and he asked a simple question of the elder: which wolf wins? And the elder says they're fighting all the time, but the wolf that wins is the one that you feed. Now the question is, friends, how do you feed the good wolf? How do you feed the good wolf? And what can you do in your agency? What can you do in your work? What can you do in your family? What can you, if you are blessed with children or grandchildren, what can you do to make sure that the good wolf in life gets fed and not the bad wolf? Over the past 30 years, as I mentioned, we've been studying this question, and we've come to some pretty firm conclusions. And that is that resilience can be learned. And no matter whether you're just starting out your career and you're 25 years old, or you're maybe thinking about retirement and you're 60 years old, there are things that you can do in your personal, professional work life that's going to build resilience. And what I'm going to talk about are 4 very important things. Now, the very first thing I'm going to talk about is something that all of us know, and that is attitude is truly everything. Now, in a way, this is nothing new. I mean, we all kind of know this. We teach this to our children and to our grandchildren. We know that attitude is absolutely everything in life. But what we've discovered is that people who are remarkably resilient, they know this in their bones. They feel this within themselves, that they can control their attitudes. The other day I was at a social gathering, and an individual came up to me and asked me an interesting question. She says, "Can you predict which of your students are going to succeed in life?" Well, I've thought about that many times, and I said, yes, I think I do know who's going to succeed. I don't know 100%. There's always students who surprise you. There's the students who you thought were going to do really well and don't do so well. And then there's the students who don't do well, and they turn out to be CEOs of companies. So it's not 100% ability to predict. But what I've discovered over the course of my career is that the critical determination of future success is can they maintain a positive attitude, especially in the dips in life. And so I'll have students who can study 2 hours before an exam, and they'll score A's. And then I have other students who are C students, and they work hard for the C's. But they've developed a very disciplined way of studying. And again, I find it's those people who have to work for the grades who turn out to be successful, because they know that attitude is everything. It doesn't matter whether you go to African cultures, whether you go to Russia, whether you go to the Middle East, whether you go to the Far East or North America. There are stories in literature which always talk about how you feed the good wolf, about how you stay positive. I want to tell you one of my very favorite stories comes out of the Middle East centuries ago. Centuries ago, the communities would put a guide between the two towns so that when people were traveling from one town to another, there would be a guide. And the guide would be stationed right in the middle. And the guide was to help travelers on their way. Now, one of the most frequent questions that travelers would ask, according to the literature, would be, what's it like ahead? What are the people in this town going to be like? And the guide would say, well, tell me, what were the people like in the town that you were just at? And some would say, well, they were awful. They were mean. They were terrible. They weren't happy. They didn't make me feel welcome. And the guide would say, well, I'm sorry to tell you, but that's kind of what you're going to find in the next town. But if the individual said, oh, they were remarkably nice, they were friendly, they were really good, the guide would be able to smile and say, those are the kind of people that you'll find in the next town. Attitude determines everything. Now I want to say this, and this is really important. The older you live, the more you have to work on your attitude. Now, that doesn't mean if you're watching this and you're 25 or 30 years old that you don't have to work on it. You have to work at it at every age. But what tends to happen to us as we age is that some of the wounds of life hit us. We get nicked. Psychologically, we have certain injuries. And as we age, we can start to pull the curtains down. We start to look more fearful at life. And it is really important as we age, that we work on having a positive mental attitude more so now than, say, 10 years ago. Some of the most wonderful research that's going on right now is on aging. And why it is that some people can turn 70 or 80 or 90 or even 100 and they're still enjoying life to the fullest. Even though they may have medical issues and problems, they're still enjoying life to the fullest. I can tell you of a man last month who was 95 years old who went out and bought a new car. He bought a new Camaro convertible. Now, not only did he buy a convertible, but he bought an extended warranty on the car at age 95. Now, how's that for being able to live positively? I don't know if you remember Dave Thomas, but he founded Wendy's Hamburger company worth zillions of dollars. At age 60, someone asked him if he had any dreams for his life. And he said, yes, he had one big dream. He wanted to go back and finish high school. He had never finished high school. And so at age 60, he went back and he graduated at age 62. And incidentally, his classmates named him the man most likely to succeed. Attitude is everything. A few months ago, I was down in Florida, and after a seminar, a woman came up to me, and she said, I just got to tell you about my dad. And I said, well, tell me. And she said, well, when he turned 98, he called me over to his house. We had a little birthday celebration. And I said to him, you got some dreams left in your life? Not expecting him to say anything big. And he says, yeah, I got one big dream. He says, what I'd like to do is I'd like to plant some apple trees in the backyard, which she knew meant that she was going to be planting the apple trees. Well, she thought, one or two, but she said he wanted me to plant 12 apple trees. She says, I got out in the hot Florida sun, and it was hot. The land was kind of parched. I was working away. It took me 2 days to plant 12 apple trees. And she says, I was so tempted at times to go back into his air-conditioned house and say to him, you're never going to see apples. Why am I doing all this? But she said, I bit my tongue, and I didn't say a word. And then her voice kind of clicked with emotion, and she said, he died a couple of months ago. And then she smiled, and she said, but at age 103, he had eaten an apple off of every one of those trees. Attitude is everything. You say, how do we feed the right wolf? How you feed the right wolf is to make sure that your positive mental attitude is increasing as you age and not decreasing. Now we come to a second point, and it's one of my favorite, and that is, if you want to be resilient, if you really want to be resilient, you need to send some good news every day. Now, I know that kind of sounds a little bit like a cliche, send good news every day. I want to tell you it isn't. And I want to tell you that some of the most major corporations in this country who are concerned about their productivity are really trying to assess their culture to see whether it's a culture of good news. I have the good fortune of getting into a lot of organizations from coast to coast. And sometimes I'm asked to sit in on staff meetings. And when I get in on those staff meetings, I note that there is a culture of wine. That's the only way I can talk about it. It's a culture of wine. And afterwards, the CEO will come up to me and says, what did you think about the staff meeting? And I'll say, is it always like that? He'll say, yeah, it often is. I say, man, you've got to change this around. You've got to change this around so that it's not a culture of wine, but it's a culture of talking about the good things that are happening. Several years ago, a colleague of mine and I decided to do a study on occupational stress. And there's been a lot of studies done on stress in middle manager and blue-collar workers, but we felt like what was needed in the research literature was a study on stress of CEOs. And so we were able to line up interviews with CEOs on how they handle stress. At the end of every interview, we asked the question, do you know of a CEO that really manages stress well? And the same name popped up again and again and again. And so I said to my colleague, we got to try to talk to him. And so we got an appointment, came in, and he was seemingly very happy to have us. He says, I understand you want to learn about stress. I don't have anything to teach you whatsoever, but I'm happy to talk with you. And I said to the gentleman, I said, well, your colleagues think very highly of you. They feel that you manage stress about as well as anybody. And he says, oh, I don't know. I don't manage stress any better than anybody else. And so I took a little further. I said, but tell us, how do you manage it? And what my colleague and I were expecting is that they were going to talk about the typical things you do to manage stress. You know, you eat a balanced meal, you exercise, you sleep, you don't drink too much caffeine, the list goes on. And we had heard this from so many people, and so that's kind of what we were expecting this gentleman to say. He didn't say any of that. He says, what I have learned is that the first 20 minutes of my day is the most important time period of them all. I had never heard that from any other executive. And I was quite curious, and so I started to drill down. The first 20 minutes of the day is the most important? He says, yes, that's the most important. I said, what do you do during the first 20 minutes? He says, I shut my door. I don't answer it for anybody. There can be a knock. I don't answer it. And he says, what I do is I write notes. Basically, I write notes. And I write notes to people who I think could benefit from a note. And I start with people in our company that are having difficult times. It could be a salesman who I know really is working hard, but just could not make the sales quotas. And so I'll write him a note congratulating him on all the work that he's done and saying to him, anything I can do to help to bring those sales up, I'll be happy to do. Or I'll think of people in our company that are going through tough times personally. I'll just write them a note. And he says, you know, I've learned through the years that those personal notes, and he made quite a point of this, I don't email. I write them out. That those personal notes mean a lot to other people when they get them. And then he kind of looked back at me and he said, with a smile, he says, you know, it may do some good for them, but it does a lot for me. And it just gets my day off to a good start. The first 20 minutes of your day, folks, are the most important part of your workday. I cannot emphasize that. I cannot overemphasize that enough. Now, you may want to do what this CEO has done and spend a little time writing notes. Or you might want to take a little different tack. And this is my tack, and I offer it to you for whatever it may be worth. When I come to the office, I'll make a list of things to do during the day. But I don't tackle the tough ones first. I go after what I call the easy wins. Now, this is kind of counterintuitive because if you take a look at business books, they'll often say, while you're fresh, you go and tackle the hard projects first. And in truth, for many people, that's probably pretty good wisdom. But I have found in my own life and in the life of my students who have adopted this, that you take a look at the list of things to do, and at least during that first hour or so, you go after what I call the easy wins. These are the things that you know that you can do that's going to matter. These are not the intractable problems that you might be facing during the day. These are the things that you know you can do well, and you can succeed at. Now, it is important in whatever mode you start the day to periodically send some good news. And I would ask you that you do not forget the most important phrase in the English language. And that most important phrase is thank you. And to say it sincerely and with some feeling. The other day I was doing a seminar for a company, and there were probably 50 or 60 leaders in the room. And it started at 7:30, it was over at noon. And the first 2.5 hours, we were roaring, things were going good. And right up front here was a woman, I suppose 40, 45 years old, and she was taking notes. Now, I want to tell you, if you want to ever make a professor happy, you want to take notes. That's what's going to do it. She was taking notes like mad. She was raising her hand, raising questions. And so when the break came, I looked at her and I said to her, you know, you're the ideal student. You're the ideal student that any professor would love to have. She says, well, I'm finding all this kind of fascinating and interesting. And so we took about a half an hour break, and she went out. And then as people were coming back in, she came back in, and she had like an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And I could see her, and she was walking down, and she was looking at that piece of paper, and she was looking at it intently. And as I saw her walk down the aisle to her seat, I thought, my goodness, whatever that she's reading, that's very important. She sat down, the seminar continued, and for the next hour and a half, she was sitting there and she was reading. And I could tell it was a letter. Over and over again, she was totally oblivious to what was going on. Now, mind you, the first couple hours she was totally engaged. The second, she wasn't engaged at all. She was focused on something else. And so the seminar was over, and I debated about, should I say anything? But she looked kind of troubled, and I thought, I'm going to just make an inquiry. And I says, I know this is probably none of my business, but I says, I can't help but notice that, you know, when we started today, you were so engaged. In the last couple hours, it just seemed like you had some other things probably very important on your mind. She says, well, at break, I went out and I got my performance review policy. It was in my mailbox. Not the policy, the actual performance review. And she said, it's right here. And she says, I'm terribly disappointed in it. And she said, would you like to read it? I said, well, it's kind of personal. And she said, no, I'd like to have you read it. And so this is the way it went. Dear so-and-so, during this past year, you've been engaged in 4 projects, and the projects were mentioned. We regret that we cannot give you or any other employees here a raise because of the economic climate. Sincerely, and then the name, Director of Human Resources. And I looked at it and I said, you know, this looks like a pretty good letter to me. I said, I suppose you're disappointed because there's no raise. Is that it? She says, no, that's not what I'm disappointed in. What I'm disappointed in is that there wasn't a simple thank you. There wasn't a simple thank you. I want to tell you what need that people have today in organizations, particularly in those organizations where people are working 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. They need a simple thank you, not a gratuitous clap on the back. What they need is, I want to thank you for that project because you really delivered the goods on it. I want to thank you for the way you dealt with that client, that patient, because the way you dealt with that client, that patient, was just superb. And I want to thank you for it. If you want to stay resilient, and if you want to nurture resilience, what you want to do is you want to send some good news. Now, the third thing you want to do is one, if we had a lot of time, I'd talk about for quite a while, because it's a fun one to talk about. And that is, you ought to be able to laugh at yourself. When I go into organizations, I'm always sometimes impressed in a negative way by how serious everything is. Now, you might come back and say, well, Bob, it's serious where I work. You know, I work in an emergency room. It's got to be serious. I work in a surgery suite. Or I'm, you know, a CEO and I'm dealing with profit and loss statements all the time. It's got to be serious. Well, I understand all that. But what I'm talking about is not taking yourself so serious. A lot of people are kind of walking around with weights, you know, that are on their shoulders. And I understand that, and it happens to all of us. There are times where we all have kind of weights on our shoulders. But what I'm talking about here is to be able to step back and not take oneself so seriously. I heard a cute story the other day that I'd like to share with you. A woman out in California got up, and it was a beautiful day, and she decided to go for a walk. And those of you who know San Diego, you know what it's like in the morning. You know, there's usually a fog, but it's beautiful. And by 10 and 11 o'clock, it starts to work its way out. And it's a gorgeous, gorgeous day. Well, she started to walk, and she continued to walk. And she got quite tired. And so she thought, I need to stop somewhere. And so there was a drugstore ahead, and she knew it served ice cream cones. And so she went to order an ice cream cone. But when she got in there were all kinds of people that were all lined up waiting for an ice cream cone. Well, she thought, I've got the time. I'm just going to kind of queue up and wait. And so she queued up, and she got up to almost the front. And then she just happened to look around a little bit, and she noticed that the person right behind her was the famous actor, Paul Newman. Now, can you imagine, supposing this was you were waiting to order an ice cream cone, and Paul Newman, or a comparable actor or actress, was right behind you. And so she said to herself, what should I do? Well, she didn't want to make a mistake. I mean, he's too great of a figure. She didn't want to make a mistake. And so she kind of composed a little speech in her mind, and she turned around and she said, you are Mr. Newman, aren't you? And he says, yes, I am. And they had this wonderful, wonderful little conversation. And so she was going out of the store. She thought, I can hardly wait to tell my kids I met Paul Newman. What an amazing thing. And then she got out of the store and she realized she had forgotten her ice cream cone. So she went back to the drugstore and she went up to the circular where all the little ice cream cones were. And she couldn't see the cone that she had ordered. Just then, there was a tap on her shoulder, and it was Mr. Newman. And he said, are you looking for your ice cream cone? And she says, yes, I am. And he replied, it's in your purse. Now, friends, who of us periodically don't put our ice cream cone in our purse symbolically? We all do. We all make mistakes, you know. We all say things which, as you're driving home at night, you say, why, I could have handled that so much better. Why at that staff meeting, why didn't I say something? Why didn't I have the courage to speak? Why was I so silent when we were talking about something that is so important? Now, when I talk about laughing at oneself, I'm talking about having some jokes on oneself, but I'm really talking once again about an attitude. To be able to step back and say, hey, it's not the end of the world as to what has happened. I want to tell you about one of my very favorite philosophers. It's a man by the name of Emerson. You probably have never heard of him. He is the philosopher, however, of cheerful purpose. And he has some wonderful tidbits which he shares with his writers. And I'm going to read this kind of slow because I want you to get the full impact of this. He writes, this time, like all times, is a very good one if we know what to do with it. Finish each day and be done with it. You've done what you could. Some blunders and absurdities, no doubt, crept in. Forget them as soon as you can. Tomorrow is a new day. Begin it well and serenely, and with too high a spirit to be encumbered with your old nonsense. In other words, be cheerful. You know, if I were to ask you, what are the issues that you were dealing with a year ago? Unless they were something really serious, like the death of a loved one or a real serious health issue, most of you would not be able to recall the issue you were dealing with a year ago. And yet a year ago is probably the most important thing that you were thinking about. Now, that's not to de-emphasize the important things that we're doing. But what it is to try to put everything in context. And those days where you go home and you say, man, I wish I would have said more, or I wish I would have said less. You say, okay, there were some absurdities that crept in, as Emerson says. But you know, there were some good things that probably happened in the day. And that's what you want to focus on as you go home. Now, the last point that I'd like to share is really an important one when it comes to what you can do to nurture resilience. Now, let's just kind of back up. We talked about the importance of attitude. We talked about the importance of sending good news every day. We talked about the importance of being able to laugh at yourself. But the last is really an important point, and that is you want to treat every day, and you want to try every day to create a masterpiece. Now, what differentiates a human being, say from your pet, is that on any given day, you can decide what kind of a day it's going to be. Now, my pet spaniel can't get up in the morning and say, I think I'm going to have a good day today, or I think there's going to be a lousy day. What differentiates human beings is the ability to get up in the morning and to make a conscious decision. And folks, it's got to be a conscious decision to say, I'm going to make this day a masterpiece. One of the great joys in my life is working with students and helping them get a philosophy of work, an understanding about what work will have in their lives. And one of the stories I always tell my students is the college student who's trying to figure out the meaning of work. And it's something that all of us wrestle with. Are you going to work 50 hours a week or 40? Are you going to pour your life into your work, or, quote, are you going to live, quote, a balanced life, unquote? What I'm trying to do is to get my students to deal with these issues, not at age 30 or 40 when they are often dealt with, but right at the outset. What is the meaning of work in your life? And I always tell them this story. It's the story of a student who was really wrestling with these issues. What about work? What meaning is it going to have in my life? And so he decides to go on a little field trip, and he goes to a construction site. And what he's going to do is he's just going to observe how people are going about their jobs, what they are doing. And so he comes up to somebody who's laying bricks, and he says to him, what are you doing? And the gentleman says, well, I'm a bricklayer. He says, I make $11.45 an hour. And that's all he said. So the young man thought about it a while and thought, well, that's one attitude to life and to work. I make $11.45 an hour. And he said, I'm not going to be pejorative about that. I mean, you have to make money to live. You have to make money to pay the mortgage, to eat. So maybe that is a good philosophy of life, that you work in order to make money so you can do the things that have to be done. But then he saw a bricklayer a few feet away, and he observed this bricklayer, and things were done just a little differently. The first bricklayer was just kind of putting the bricks together, putting the cement on, getting it done, trying to get the job done. But he noticed the second bricklayer was just a little bit more deliberate. And the second bricklayer would be stepping back and looking at the bricks as he was making it. And the young man, who was very astute, knew that this individual had a different attitude towards work than the first one. So he went up to the second bricklayer and said, sir, what is it you're doing? He says, well, I'm a bricklayer. But what I'm trying to do is to be the best bricklayer on this project. Well, the young man thought about that. Isn't that interesting, to be the best bricklayer on this project? Well, that's a whole different philosophy of work. Not only are you making money, but you're going to be good at what you do. And my guess is that many of you who are watching this telecast right now, this is your orientation. You want to be the best public health nurse. You want to be the best sanitarian. If you're in the private sector, you want to be the best CEO or the best middle manager. If you're in nonprofit work, you want to be the best whatever it is that you're doing to make life better for others. And that is your orientation. Well, he was all done, so he thought. But then over in the corner there was a third bricklayer. Now this bricklayer, he was laying the bricks much slower. And he wasn't far as long as the first one. The first one, it was going up quite fast, and he wasn't quite as far along as the second one. But he went over to there, and the bricklayer didn't see him observe, but the young man just observed the work that was going on. And the third bricklayer was very careful. He made sure that the bricks were smooth. When the cement went in between the cracks, he made sure that there was just enough cement there. And gradually, brick by brick, the edifice was being built. And so he went up to the third bricklayer and he says, sir, what are you doing? And he says, well, I'm a bricklayer. What am I doing? I'm building a cathedral. Now the young man says, that's a whole different orientation to life. I'm building a cathedral. Now for those of you who are in public health, what we're doing is we're building our cathedrals. We're building a better life, hopefully, not just for ourselves and making X amount of money a day. What we are doing is we're building, hopefully in concert with others, a better life for others. I can't imagine, as I've often said to many audiences, a better career to go in than public health. But no matter what your career may be, Keep in mind that you are building cathedrals, making life better for others. So, my friends, what can we say about resilience based on the latest research? And I'm trying to give you some of the latest material that I can, is that resilience is something that is learned. You say, well, aren't some people born with a greater amount of resilience? And the answer to that question is yes. There are some people who innately, it's in the genes. But what we do know is that resilience is something that is learned. And no matter whether you work in a big corporation or you work with a tribe, it doesn't matter where you work. What we do know is that it is possible to increase the resilience of organizations and of employees everywhere. I'm so glad you tuned into this telecast. I hope that you have found it helpful. I hope that you found it meaningful. And if you would like to have additional information, if you'd like to get into some of the scholarly research that is behind some of these things that I've talked about today, I'm going to put up here my website. And on my website are articles that I've written that really relate to the subject of resilience. I'd be delighted for you to go in, take a look at those articles. And if you'd like to email, you'll see my email address there. I'd be delighted to hear from you at any time. Again, thank you so much, and I want to thank the University of Minnesota, particularly its School of Public Health, which I think the world of, and some wonderful employees that we have here in the audience today. I want to thank you for your time.